Hi and thanks for joining me. What we're going to do in this video is focus on an exam skill. We're looking at paper 2 of the AQA A-Level British History qualification. Now paper 2 lasts 2 hours 30 minutes. You've got to complete one source question, which is worth 30 marks, and 2 essays from a choice of 3. And each of the essay questions is worth 25 marks. So in total you've got 80 marks to gain over the 2.5 hours. When you break that down, you've got about 50 minutes to complete a source question. So you're going to be spending about 15 minutes on each source. That's worth understanding when you're looking at your pace and your timing when you're going through this exam. So 15 minutes for each source, and that'll give you about 50 minutes, allowing for yourself to orientate yourself and to check your answer before you move on to your essay questions. So let's look at what you're going to need to do to answer that source question well and get the marks you're going to be looking for. Now the first thing you're going to see is that the question is going to be related to the value of the source, and it's going to be very specific what it's talking about. And it's important that you recognise that early on. And I've put an example up for us to look at here. And the example I've said is, with reference to these sources and your understanding of the historical context, assess the value of these 3 sources to a historian studying the reasons for the 1984-1985 miners' strike. And I've highlighted that piece, studying the reasons for the 1985 miners' strike. So when you are answering that question, when you are talking about or writing about those sources, you need to always link it back to the miners' strike, the 1983-1984 miners' strike. It's no good writing about Margaret Thatcher in general. You've got to be talking about the miners' strike in specific detail. Otherwise, you're not going to get the marks that you deserve. So make sure that when you see that question, you identify what it is talking about. Highlight that, underline it. So when you're writing your question, you can always go back, double check and say, yeah, am I answering this? Yes, that's what it's asking me to talk about. Now, when we look at the source, we're going to be focusing on 3 things within it. We're going to be looking at provenance, tone, and content. Now, the provenance essentially is who wrote it, when they wrote it, what it is, what's its intended audience. And you've got a slide in front of you to help you understand that in that little bit more detail. The reality is that not all of those will be relevant to every source though. So for example, sources that come from political leaders often give an insight into their opinion and their motives, particularly biographies that come from political leaders. Margaret Thatcher's biography, Tony Blair's biography, all of these give an insight into what they're doing or what they're thinking. Sources closer to events may be more honest, whilst further away from an event may be more reflective, may take that wider view. However, it's important to bear in mind here, don't give what I describe as a glib answer, a very basic answer of saying, source A is valuable because it's close to the event, therefore it's more trustworthy. You've got to back yourself up with a lot more detail, a lot more judgment than that. Because a source that is produced some time after the event may be able to look at it in the round, in the wider perspective. So don't write off a source just because it wasn't written immediately after or close to an event. Don't place more value in a source just because it was written when an event took place. You've always got to back up this view with judgment and knowledge. Autobiographies generally present the author in a good light. So when Margaret Thatcher wrote her own autobiography, she wasn't going to present herself in a bad light. Similarly, Tony Blair's not going to do. That's human nature. So the author of a book is never going to present themselves in a bad light. And you need to bear that in mind when you're thinking about the provenance of a source. Diaries, which are often written by political people. Tony Benn's a good example for a diarist throughout political times. Quite often these diaries are not written for public viewing or not written for being published at the time they're written. It's expected they'll be published a number of years down the line, and therefore the author is not as concerned about what they're writing. And government documents, government circulars, quite often are never intended for public viewing. You've got the 30-year rule, which means that a government document won't be published for 30 years, and therefore you get an insight into a government's thinking, what a government is planning, what their view is during that period. And then you need to think about, is a source stoking up support for something? A good example here are political manifestos. Are they making a promise to try and win votes? Is a leader or a politician making a speech to stoke up support? Harold Wilson's White Heat of Technology speech, that's an example of that. Enoch Powell's Rivers of Blood speech, which I'll go to again in a moment, that's an example of stoking up support, stoking up feeling. And that takes us on to tone. So I've talked about provenance. We then need to think about tone. And the tone within a source might not always be relevant. Sometimes it will, sometimes it won't. And that's where you need to make a judgment. For example, government documents will generally lack tone, but speeches are likely to contain tone. And I've given an example for you here. Enoch Powell's Rivers of Blood speech certainly contains a lot of tone. This idea of us being mad, of us being insane by allowing immigrants in. Yet Circular 10 of 65 by Tony Crosland, which is supporting comprehensive schools, lacks the tone. It's a government document, so you need to be able to identify that when we're writing about sources. And then we're going to look at this contextual knowledge. And you need to be selective here. It's no good just writing as much as you know about something. The knowledge has to relate to the question. So back to that example I gave over the miners' strike, 1983-84. You'd have to include knowledge which relates specific to that question and to that period. Not just to Margaret Thatcher in general, not just to industrial disputes in general. You'd have to relate it to that specific event. And it's important that you do that because it demonstrates a knowledge of issues surrounding that question, issues surrounding the incident that you have been directed to look at. So then we need to look at this idea of what makes a source valuable and what makes it not valuable. That's where you've got to give your judgment at the end of your writing, at the end of your paragraph about that source. And I've given here some examples of what makes a source valuable. So first of all, if a source is accurate, if it conveys accurate information which is valuable to the historian, does it back up what you already know? Does it show what you know to be correct? And can you show that with your own knowledge? However, a trap that people often fall into is when a source is inaccurate, writing it off as saying, well, it's not valuable. And that's not the case. An inaccurate source will still be valuable to an historian. It gives an insight as to why information has been distorted. And I've said here, is it deliberate? Is it propaganda? A classic example of a source which is not accurate is Anthony Eden's speech in the House of Commons in 1956 at the Suez Crisis. He lies, we know that. That's valuable to a historian. Why is he lying? What is he trying to achieve by lying? All of that is valuable to a historian. Also, a source is valuable if we're getting the viewpoint from one person, specifically if that person is significant to events of the period. So therefore, a good example being Alistair Campbell's diaries, who was an aide of Tony Blair, a spin doctor for Tony Blair essentially. But his diaries are useful in giving an insight to Tony Blair's government during that time. For example, the Good Friday Agreement. Alistair Campbell's diaries allow us that access into what's going on at that period. It makes them valuable. And also, is that viewpoint held by many during the period? Is it typical of that period? Are we getting an idea of a broader view? In this idea, an understanding of the audience. So, for example, is a politician giving a speech to a group of people he knows or she knows will be on side? Really good example here is whenever a politician speaks at their party conference. So Labour Party conference, Conservative Party conference, all the key parties. Generally when a speech is given there, you are speaking to the converted. You are speaking to your friendly audience. That is useful because it tells you that is a widely held view, certainly within that political party. So then we need to think about, how do we answer a source question? We open up the paper, and we see the question, and we see those three sources in front of us. Well, the obvious thing first to do is breathe, don't panic. Take a breath, and then look at these sources. And what is really important you do with each source, read the source and the attribution. So by that I mean, who wrote the source, when did they write it, what kind of document or speech is it? Make sure you read that, because that is going to be key for you understanding that provenance and being able to write about that provenance. And also read the source completely before you do anything else, because there is an urge as soon as you see a key line or a key word to immediately dive in there. You need to understand the source in the round before we do anything else. Highlight, underline those keywords that you see, but make sure you read that source. Then you need to start thinking about what is valuable in that source and what is not valuable in that source, and starting to add your own knowledge to back that up. You also need to be thinking about the provenance at this point as well. What is helping you answer the question? And it's important you include your own knowledge here. It is no good with just very general comments. Got to include specific detail, because that's what's going to allow you to move from a level 2 up to a level 3 up to a level 4. Showing that knowledge, showing specific knowledge that relates directly to the question. And then you need to give balance to your answer. You need to be able to show that the source is valuable because of these aspects, but it's not valuable because of these other aspects to consider, all the time backed up with knowledge. However, it comes down to you as a historian essentially to make a judgment in the end. How valuable is this source in relation to X? You need to make a judgment, and you need to be clear in that judgment and explain why you've made that judgment. Because if you don't, you're not going to get the marks you deserve. You've got to make a judgment for all three sources. Now, what I've shown you is a mark scheme. Now, this is a general mark scheme that would cover any of the sources. And what I would suggest you do is you pause this video now. Take in what you can see in front of you. But what you will be able to see is how each source requires, at each level requires you to be able to produce more content or more detail. So for example, level 1, a limited understanding both of the provenance or the content, so the person hasn't achieved both, limiting understanding of content, and some comment on the value of at least one source. So if you only do one source, you're only going to get level 1. If we manage to do some comment on the value of 2 sources, we're going to get it up there to level 2 maybe. The analysis may be basic, it may lack detail. And we may only focus on provenance or content. Now we're talking at level 2 though. We need to be including provenance and content to get to level 3. And when we get to level 3, that's when we start seeing an attempt to consider the value across all 3 sources. So if you have not written about provenance and content on all 3 sources and given a judgment on all 3 sources, you aren't going to level 3. And it's really important you understand that. Now when we get to level 4 and level 5, This is really where we're getting those top marks. This is where we're pushing hard. And it's important we show a good understanding of the sources, the provenance, the content, really good knowledge that links directly back to that question, and a balanced argument. Where is the source valuable? Where is it not valuable? That will allow you to get to level 4 and level 5. Now the difference there between the 4 and the 5 is that nuance of how much knowledge you can show that is relevant to the question. How can you show a good understanding of the provenance and the content? How balanced and well supported is your argument? They're the things that will make that difference between a 4 and a 5. It's not easy, but it is something that is worth achieving. So there you have it, a very quick run through the source questions for AQA A-level history on paper 2 of the exam. Thanks very much. Bye bye.